Welcome to this introduction to the Control Structures Assessment Tool, part of the Risk Assessment Toolkit offered by the University of California Office of the President, Office of Risk Services. The UCOP Office of Risk Services offers several of these Excel-based workbooks to meet a diverse set of risk assessment needs across the UC system. Each of these tools has been constructed to provide insight from multiple perspectives. For a complete list of the tools available in the toolkit, please refer to the ERM website. This webinar, again, is focused on the Control Structures Assessment Tool. This tool builds upon other risk assessment tools and will help you consider not only the impact and likelihood for a selected list of risks, but also help you evaluate the effectiveness of current controls and help you understand whether any changes may be required to bring the list of risks within your organization's risk appetite. The purpose of this tool is not to ensure that all risks are rated as adequately controlled, but rather to help departments assess their control structure for sufficiency, given the environment they operate in, their resources, and their bandwidth. It's important to understand that this tool is designed to help you make better, more risk-aware decisions, but it will not tell you what the right answer is either. These tools function to support a methodical thought process that can be consistently applied to thoroughly evaluate various risks, enabling the user to make better informed decisions. Now, the nature of doing a risk assessment is highly subjective, and it only provides a user's perception of risks and related impacts. This is why it's also important to evaluate correlating data along with the risk assessment whenever possible to validate your assumptions. Inaccurate data or other information not provided by the user will naturally affect any results or decisions or recommendations. Now, final decisions should be made independently by each organization using this tool. So, with that in mind, let's move on to the actual demonstration of the tool and show you how you can use it. We're going to start at the introduction by filling in some basic information about who's using the tool right here in these white boxes. And then we're going to save it with a unique name in a location we can remember for later. Now, one more note before we get too far along here. When you first open the file, you may get a warning about macros or security, like this one up here. Now, when you open the file, please don't be alarmed by this, because it's mainly there because the file has a macro to allow the data that you enter to be exported into a flat, comma-separated value file. Now, essentially, if you're planning on using this data that you enter here in UC's Enterprise Risk Management Information System, also known as ERMIS, you'll want to enable the macros. But if the tool will still work fully if you decide not to enable the macros. Now, of course, please make sure that you're adhering to any IT security policies that your organization has. Now, in some cases, your computer security settings may prevent you from enabling the macro altogether. In this case, if you wish to use the macro, you'd need to consult with your system administrator, and he or she would be able to alter your computer security settings. So, I'm going to enable this content on mine. Click OK. And then let's get started. We can read some instructions here, and please do when you first open up the tool. For this demonstration, we've sort of covered this material already, so we're going to move on to Get Started down at the bottom here. And that takes us to this page, Customizing Scales. So we need to set some common parameters so we understand what different terms mean when we use them in this tool. We can start with the weighting up in the top right corner here. Depending on the types of risks we're considering, our weights for risk impact and risk likelihood might change. Now, for instance, if we're using this tool to consider risks that could cause workers' compensation claims, and we're focusing on that area, then we're probably going to weight likelihood higher, because there are statutory limits to how severe most claims will be, at least in California. So the biggest thing impacting our organization is probably going to be how many claims occur rather than how severe they are. However, if instead we're considering risks related to our organization's professional liability, then we might weight impact higher because severe incidents are likely to affect our organization even in small numbers. Now, for this demonstration, we have a wide variety of risks that we've listed in our demonstration. So we're going to keep the weighting as it is here and weight the two evenly at 50% each. Now let's move on to considering some of our other scales here. Now, scale matters when we're considering risk impact and risk likelihood and our existing control effectiveness. Now, what I mean by scale is that some sort of a loss or a risk-related incident which constitutes only a moderate impact for a campus as a whole, if we scale that scope down to something like an individual department, that same type of loss, that same event, could actually be operationally disabling or very severe. In this case, we would call that a very high impact using this terminology. So depending on our scale, we can transition between moderate and very high with the exact same incident. So we need to have a consistent frame of reference, and we can modify these scales so that we understand what each of these means as we're going through the tool and using them consistently. Now, also, each of these scales can be customizable. That's why we call it customized scales up here. And how we would actually do that is simply by overriding one of these definitions. And we can overwrite any one of these that we see fit. So for instance, let's take an easy one here. If we looked at very low, and in our organization, instead of using a term like very low, we wanted to use a different one, such as negligible, to convey that same sort of scale, but using our own organization's terminology. And simply we can type in negligible right over this scale here. And when I do that, this word will show up in every one of the future steps that show up in this tool. So when I use this scale in the future, negligible would be one of the options that I can select from a drop-down menu. And then I'd want to define it if that definition changes with the wording change. I would also want to make that change here as well. Now, because we've already filled in part of this tool with demonstration data using very low further on there, I'm actually going to go back and change this right now back to very low so that way we can keep everything consistent and so the calculations will work properly. But if you were to make these changes and then make selections later on with that, then those selections would be completely in line and calculate out just fine. So you'll also notice one aspect of this sheet and also the other pages that we look at is that some cells are white and others are gray or shaded in as gray. The gray cells have formatting or formulas in them, and we want to protect them in order to ensure that a user doesn't accidentally make changes that affect the tool by making it inoperative or changing some sort of calculation. So we've protected those cells, and they shouldn't be modified. However, if you see a cell here with white space or blank text in it like this here, feel free to modify the text or make changes as you see fit to those cells. Okay, so one last thing that you'll see on every one of the pages in the tool here is on the left-hand side, we've got buttons. Now, these buttons allow us to navigate between the various steps. They remain in a consistent position for most of these steps as well, so we can always know where to find them so we can move around easily. So we've decided on our scales, we've decided on our weighting, so let's move on to the risk assessment page. Now, in this step, we're assessing risks, quite simply. Now, these can be risks that you may have used in earlier tools, or it can be a list of risks that you want to assess for the first time. We have 45 numbered spaces here for you to list your risks. Now, these have been filled in already here with a list that includes domestic terrorism, catastrophic natural event, pandemic, laboratory safety. But if you wanted to fill these in with any other set of risks, this is the place to do it. When you receive this tool from the ERM help desk, these spaces here in all of these will be blank. So Once you've listed your risks, you should describe the consequences if the controls for that risk were to fail. Now, these consequences can be described in terms of strategy, in terms of reputation, in terms of financial impact, or injuries to personnel, damage to property, or in terms of impairing, say, a vital mission that your organization has. Now, next, we want to select a scale which most closely matches the impact and likelihood of this failure in the two drop-down menus in these next two columns. So impact, we can choose from very high, high, moderate, low, very low. Again, if we made changes to the previous scales, they would be reflected in these drop-down menus. So we can make changes to these here. And of course, when we first get this tool, remember these are blank. And we can also choose how likely these things are going to be as well. So let's change terrorism back to very high here under impact. All right, so then next we're going to describe how our organization is currently managing each risk. We're describing any mitigation efforts, any plans which are already in place. These are our current controls, our current management and mitigation in this column right here. Then we want to assess the effectiveness of controls that we just described by selecting a scale from the drop-down menu in the next column over. Here we say that our controls regarding domestic terrorism are significant. If we wanted to make a change to this here, we can change it by selecting one of these here. And again, this reflects the customized scales that we've had on the previous page. So, once we've made this selection, then we have all the basic information that we need to calculate the risk rating with existing controls. That's this red, yellow, and green column that we see immediately to the right of what we were just selecting. Now, this column, the selections that show up here are not something you can modify. These are calculated, these are formulas, they're protected. So this is something that will pop up when you're done entering in this last piece of data. When you do, let's go over what each of these definitions means here. So there are two different types of settings here that show as yellow. That's potentially poorly controlled and also potentially over-controlled. Now, in both of these cases, when you see this, it means that management should review these risks to determine if controls need to be modified, and they should then make changes appropriately. If we see something green that says adequately controlled, then that says that no immediate action is required. We'd simply monitor these. And then if we see one in red, for instance, as we have for facilities and ground safety in this example, then we would know that these risks should receive immediate attention. Now finally, we want to select yes or no from the drop-down menu in the last column to determine whether or not this risk will be plotted onto the chart. Now, this tool has a chart, and we'll go into details on that later, but this is an easy way for us to come back and say we want this to show up on the chart or not. To start with, the first 10 or so show up on the chart, but again, if we want to modify that, we simply select yes or no for the appropriate ones and make that decision as we see fit. So once we've done all of this here, then we want to move on to the additional controls. This is where we assess ways to improve our controls. Now, the first three columns of this page here, that's risks, current mitigation and management, and risk rating with existing controls. These three columns here are automatically populated based on your input from the risk assessment step. We're really just copying them over here. You can refer to them. Now, these are shaded in, and if you want to make changes to them, you should do so on the risk assessment page instead. Simply click the button up here, go back to that page. You can make a change. Whoops, click the wrong one. Click the risk assessment one here, and you can go back and forth between them to make changes as you see fit. All right, back on the additional controls page. Let's go into this a little deeper. Now, starting with the changes to controls column, we want to describe any changes to the controls that we're considering implementing. anything that would help us either improve them, or if we see that something's over-controlled, we could perhaps divert some of those resources that are being devoted to those controls to something that is potentially under-controlled. Once we've actually described the changes, then we want to describe what we would expect that effectiveness to be, and how the impact of our changes will affect how this risk is controlled. So, for instance, in this one here, we have our changes are simply to continue current efforts with current controls, so we have no change in our current control effectiveness. That one's pretty simple, and for a lot of the ones that we decide are adequately controlled or within our risk appetite in other ways, we're going to have that as a common selection. However, if we decide that we want to increase funding, then we want to decide, well, what does that mean for this risk for facilities and ground safety? If we want to improve it somehow, then we need to decide, are we significantly improving it, moderately improving it, minorly improving it, and also on the flip side of this, for something where we have something that's potentially over-controlled and we want to potentially move funds over to other priorities, such as this laboratory safety example here, then we can decide if this is, to what extent is this a decrease in the effectiveness of our controls? Are we minorly decreasing, moderately, significantly, or are we removing the controls altogether? And so this changes our score again. And then we recalculate the risk rating once we've made those changes. So once we take a look at what this risk rating after changes to controls means, again, this can be interpreted in much the same way that the previous one, where adequately controlled means that we should simply monitor these and probably not need any immediate action. Potentially poorly controlled, or other red ones like poorly controlled, would require some attention, including those that are potentially over-controlled still. Once we've understood all these risk ratings, though, then we can also assign an accountable person or department. This is a free-form text field that will be blank when you receive your version of this tool here. And this allows us to document a little bit of the accountability that goes into understanding who's responsible for these controls, who's responsible for making these changes or improving these controls. So we know who to go back to and talk to about, or which department this sort of improvement would be assigned to. All right, so when we've completed all of these steps, we're able to export this data into a flat, comma-separated value file, also known as a CSV, simply by clicking this button. This is the one part of this tool that uses a macro. So if you've not enabled your macros, this button here will not function properly, and you need to find another way to copy this data out of the tool in order to get it out of this format. And there are ways to do that. You can contact the ERM help desk for those ways. So let's take a look, now that we've covered sort of the data entry part of this, let's take a look at the chart and see sort of what we have here. Now this chart here, let me zoom in so we can see it a bit better. There we go. So this is a graphical representation of our risk assessment based upon our selections for risk likelihood and risk impact. Now there are two parameters that we can change that allow us to select which information gets shown on this chart. Now for instance, we can show it without any controls, which would be this here. Okay, we can see that we have larger bubbles up in the top right, more that are higher risk, higher likelihood, and higher impact. And then we can consider them with our current control. We can see that some of these other bubbles start to migrate in. We see number 12 here actually moved in from further out in the aether here, or also may have been covered up by another. And then finally, after our proposed control changes, we can see that these others start to migrate in closer and closer into having a lower likelihood and a lower impact. Now the other part of this is that we can change the labels here. Now each of these numbers, you can see back here on the risk assessment or the control pages, we have numbers associated with each risk. Those chart numbers are corresponding to these numbers here. However, if instead we'd prefer to use the names of those risks, then we can simply, again, see that I would need to go back and edit the names of the risks I'm looking at to be much more succinct in order to have them show up in a more legible way up on here. But if you are going to use short names for your risks or abbreviated names for your risks, then you can use the names here, and this will show up much more easily on this. And now also you can move around these labels if you need to. So you can actually move them if you need to, but I would actually suggest first making them shorter or simply using numbers as the reference points for them. That may be easier to make this an understandable chart that you can actually see and glean some information from. So we've covered the chart, we've covered how to actually look at the assessment, and then also how to look at additional controls. So that covers our demonstration of this tool today. Now, please remember that the results of any risk management decision will only be as effective as the data that you've entered. Inaccurate data or other information that you're not providing as a user will naturally affect any results, decisions, or recommendations. And like other risk assessment toolkits, pieces like this, other tools in this toolkit, this tool here is just a tool. It helps users analyze their risks, analyze their controls, understand those things, but it does not provide answers. Now, if you have questions about this tool or comments, you can direct them to the ERM help desk at erm@ucop.edu. Thanks again for watching.
Thank you. Please stand by.